Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to today's Reddit Quickie from the subreddit HFY, called The Storm Rider, written by Legal. The link to the original will be down below, and as always, I hope you enjoy. Lukas enjoyed first contacts like this. A stroll through a technologically inferior, yet highly sophisticated culture often taught him much about the way intelligent species worked. It was especially nice when the new species was so friendly and open. The Marines had even left behind their gear in the ship. It was clear that these Xenos would cause him no harm. To be honest, Lukas was happy to get away from the main group now and explore the little around the town. It gave him a chance to observe and think more freely. He knew where the other towns that this stretched up and down the very thin stretch of land between the planet's massive oceans, but this one seemed to be the largest and most connected. They had technology on par with perhaps the height of the Roman Empire back on Earth, but none of the grand structures. They had very simple buildings, yet very intricate and complicated sanitation and water irrigation systems. It was a curious contrast. No grand temples, no citadels or fortresses. They didn't even have an army, though there was some sort of form of basic police and guard militia. The creatures themselves also were interesting greatly. It was as if they took human and an octopus and merged them together. Their faces were vaguely humanoid, although their eyes did creep him out slightly, as they resembled the eyes of cephalopods. They had their hair, with which they kept neat and orderly in a variety of colours on the blue side of the colour spectrum, with white mixed in here and there. They were on the thinner side compared to a normal human, and their four-fingered hands were webbed. Not to mention their very interesting skin that seemed to him to be able to change colour and blend with the environment. But they made a clearly conscious effort to maintain one particular colour or pattern and not change. Below their torsos, they had 4 or 6 tentacles instead of legs. One would think, without a bone structure, that walking around upright would make no sense. Yet they kept their lower tentacles closer together and walked around on them like they did on their own 2 feet. Why? He found this as curious as everything else about them. They were amphibious and had no issue breathing underwater. So why settle purely above the ground? Why walk around like they had regular legs? He had so many questions. As he wandered down the town, he found himself heading out towards the beach and the sand of the crashing waves. Much of the coastline was a thin and wandering continent, was rocky and treacherous. He'd seen how much of it was sheer cliff and dropped off 50 meters into jagged rocks. But this town was built right next to a massive sloping sandy beach. There was still a great deal of rocks and boulders in the surf, and he could still see, but clearly they'd made an effort to move them out of the way. Walking down closer to the edge of the water, Lukas looked out and then stopped, gasping softly as he realized the sheer scale of the waves stretching out ahead of him. From an orbital, he hadn't paid much attention to the pictures. Waves were waves. But down here, he could see he had 13 to 14 meter high at least. As he watched one of the massive waves break and fall, the sound of it smashing down, folding into itself before the bay, and how the town and beach began to understand why they had been built on land. If this planet's ocean was so rough and violent, wooden boats would be demolished in quick order. It was mesmerizing to him to stand and watch the giant waves crash down at the edge of the bay, and to see all the water rush in through the rocks on the boulders and be pushed to the sides, filling the bay and racing up the beach just before receding to give way to another rush of water, brought on by the thunderous implosions of another wave. He stood transfixed as he watched it. The crashing, booming echo of a wave after wave washing over him as the waves washed over the sand. Maybe this is why they had no churches or temples. Who would need such a thing when they could stand here and watch the power of nature itself? He finally tore his eyes away from the scene before him to look around when he spotted one of the locals. Judging by its hair length, he thought that it might be female. But instead of the ordered braids and tiny buns he'd been seeing, this one kept her hair wild. She stood at a high point of the wet sands, and the water washing over her feet briefly in every wave. Tentacles, he had to correct himself mentally. Strangely, she supported next to her a massive plank of wood. It was polished and obviously crafted, specifically with smooth, rounded edges and a rounded tip, but he didn't understand its purpose. He looked down at his dress and shoes and pants, already sandy from the beach he walked. Shrugging it off, he walked further down to approach the native. Soft crunching of his shoes in the sand, between the roar of the crashing waves announcing his presence long before he reached her. He stood to her left, a meter away, and waited for some sort of reaction. But as he stood and waited, she jumped up, looking over at the waves. Finally, he decided it was time to announce himself. "I say to you, greetings. May the rock shelter you and your waves guide you." The ship's AI had worked out their basic language before they landed, and this translator had proved operational so far today. But the female just kept standing there, her wild, unkempt hair picking up a little as a warm breeze blew over the beach. "Hello?" He tried again, but got nothing. After a moment he lifted his foot from foot, unsure how to get her attention, and not wanting to reach out and tap her on the shoulder. "What's with the board?" Now the female finally looked over at him, and she smiled despite how those eyes creeped him out. At least he had her attention now. "It is for riding the waves." That was all she said before looking back at the ocean. Lukas frowned a little then. "Most of your people are in town meeting with my people. We just arrived from the stars themselves. Were you not curious?" It was unusual for the primitive to be entirely uninterested in new people who came from another world, but this one didn't seem impressed. "They forget their duty. We must watch and wait for his return." He looked at her from the ocean and back again, wondering who else might be crazy enough to brave those waves. "Whose return?" he finally asked. "The Storm Rider," she stated in a... He paused. Was that English? His translator hadn't done it. That had it. It sounded... "The Storm Rider?" he asked in English, and then arched his brows in surprise when she nodded. "You speak English?" he tried, and then she shook him at once more. "I speak Ancient," she said in English before returning to her native tongue, his language. "I am the High Priestess Shedia of the Waves of the Storms. I, as my mother and her mother and each generation have done, am blessed of the 4 generations to be alive for this return. Though the others speak of him as a legend and myth, I know the truth. I see him in my dreams. I have read the patterns of the waves. He will return soon for the sight of the storm and wave." Lukas was stunned now. What was she talking about? He knew they worshipped some sort of ancient Storm Rider figure, but he hadn't given it much thought. If there was no temples dedicated to him, he didn't think the religion was well established. But she spoke some English and talked about the return of his figure now, after 4 generations of her people. "Who is he?" he asked in English, and she responded in kind. "He is the one who delivered us from the storms. He who taught our ancestors not to swim beneath the rocks, not to be smashed against them at the whirl of the waves, but how to ride over them, to weave through them. He who taught us the righteousness in all things, that sharing is caring, but not to be a total pinkos. He who had ridden the storm for 1,000 years only to return to us and share the bounty of knowledge and love of the ocean. He who killed the great big fracking shark and shared with us the flesh and spared us its wrath. He who gave us the gift of surfing." Lukas realized that by the end of this his mouth was hanging open. They weren't the first humans here, or at least human. There had been more than one, right? But how? Who? This planet wasn't listed as far as he knew, and they should be the first ones here. They hadn't found any comm relays or sensor buoys, and who would even be out this far? He had so many questions, but before he could ask, the native pointed out, "He comes." When Lukas followed her pointing finger, he gasped again. There, riding a 20-meter wave above a lone figure out in the distance. He could see him on some sort of board far more colorful than the wood plank the native used. He was riding along the edge of the curling break of the wave. Lukas watched the waves start to crash down and gasped again, positive that the water was closing down on itself and the rider would surely have been crushed beneath it. But then, at the very edge of the bay, he shot out from the collapsing wave, seeming to skip over the water, weaving between the rocks and then riding up to the beach before jumping off in a colourful ball and picking it up, jogging up the beach towards him. "Hey, Sheila, not much of a turnout this year, eh?" He reached out to the native and extended her hand, well before Lukas watched some sort of strange, sophisticated slapping and turning of the hands in a gesture that he didn't understand. Lukas looked at the human over more closely now. He had a weathered face and a body that looked to be in incredibly great shape aside from being older. His hair was blonde aside from the greying temples, and he had one of the widest, brightest smiles that Lukas had ever seen without looking forced or faked. Yes, Storm Rider, they were focused on the arrival of new ancients. When she motioned to Lukas, the surfer turned and smiled wide. "Hey, Brochacho, my amigo, am I glad to see you?" Lukas barely had time to blink before the large surfer was engulfing him in a tight hug, further ruining his nice clothes by getting them wet. When the surfer finally let go of Lukas, took a gasp of air as he stammered to find the words. Any words. "It's about time you got here from Broheim. I had like 2 more jumps of fuel. I was wondering where you'd get here." "Who are you?" Lukas finally asked as his shock was overcome. "Me! Broheim didn't read the file. I'm the gate supervisor, Matinzo. Well, I guess it's like a supervisor, but it's just me and Dave, the AI, and the robots and stuff. Didn't get a signal to turn on the gate. What gives?" "Gate? What gate?" Lukas asked, very confused. "The wormhole gate. That's what you guys sent me here to make, cha?" After a few moments of surfer tilted his head. "Wait, are you not from the tidal travel? Wormhole gates, those have been outlawed for 1,000 years. You're a gate builder." Lukas gasped, finally starting to understand what was going on. "Cha? 1,000 years, you say? Oh, man, totally didn't mean to break the law. Am I in trouble?" That bright smile finally faded. "What? No? I don't think so. You were just a builder, right? That's fine, I think." With that, surfer laughed, his big smile coming right back as he slapped Lukas on the shoulder hard enough to make him stagger. "Cool beans, bro. Well, tidal travel is gone. Then I guess I don't get paid. That's a bummer, man. But this place has some real cool waves and stuff. Maybe I'll just find a couch and crash for a while. Hey, great talking to you, bro, and the waves are calling. I'll be back in a few hours when they die down. You ready, Sheila?" He looked at the native, who nodded and picked up a board. "Very ready, Storm Rider. I'm sure you are. Your great-great-grandmother, or whatever, could totally shred. Let's see if you can too." With that, they began to run down the beach to get back to the water, and Lukas was left confused and stunned for a moment. "Wait, why did you teach them to surf?" Lukas called out. "I came down for the waves. The waves here are freaking sick. I think I saw some poor octopoodle trying to get up onto the beach, only to get smashed into the rocks. Had to help the little homies get over the rocks, get him onto land and teach him how to build huts and couches and crash on. They've got killer sashimi, dude. Once they figure out the rice, the sushi here is gonna be amazing. Talk later, bro." The surfer called out before pulling himself up onto the board and paddling out. Lukas blinked as he watched the 2 figures start to paddle out towards the massive waves still crashing down on the edge of the bay. Lukas was entirely at a loss to do right now. He heard some of the great builders in the past going mad and trying to conquer primitive species by proclaiming that they were a god, or the like. He'd even heard of the more cases of them trying to help the locals in some small way. But this was certainly the first time he'd ever found a builder that had taught the locals to surf and be righteous. However, considering the peaceful and happy nature of the natives and how welcoming they'd been upon their ambassador's arrival, Lukas was doing diplomacy wrong. Normally it took a team of skilled sociologists, anthropologists, and other diplomatic experts to help prepare a species for the Federation. And here, one man had done that all on his own, because he wanted to surf, and apparently a couch to crash on, and to eat sashimi. Lukas slowly shook his head as he watched him get closer to the crashing waves. How the hell was he going to explain this to his superiors? End of story. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel or the author, all the stuff is down below. And as always, I hope that you guys have a good one, and I'll see you in the next story. Cheers.